Women's suffrage is actually one of my passion areas, if you didn't know that about me. Not quite up there with Elvis, but pretty darn close. I teach a whole semester course on it, but I'm going to try to boil it down into one module for you, so we better get right to it. Women's suffrage in the United States actually has its roots going back to the American Revolution. Women participated in the American Revolution socially, economically, politically in some ways, and even in the military. They served in the American forces, usually in disguise. At the conclusion of the war, they thought, well, we had participated fully in this war, we should get the full benefits of it, voting rights. They were told no, that men would vote on their behalf. They would vote with women's best interest. Instead, they were told that women's job in the nation was to raise up the next generation of virtuous citizens, specifically to raise up good sons who would be able to take over the nation at one point. Now, this served for quite a few decades, but in the early 19th century, we see more and more women getting involved in reform movements, whether this is penitentiary reform, temperance reform, or more women were getting involved in the abolitionist movement, black women and white women. What they found was they couldn't convince politicians, they couldn't convince congressmen to vote to get rid of slavery, because why would a politician listen to a woman when a woman didn't have the right to vote? They were paying attention to their voting constituents. So abolition leads directly into the fight for women's suffrage. Now, things got paused a little bit in the years right before the Civil War and after, because the focus became on the war and ending slavery. At the conclusion of the Civil War, women thought, as rights were being discussed in citizenship and voting, they thought they would get the right to vote. They were told, no, for right now we're only dealing with black men. This coalesced the movement in different ways. What we see are some splits starting to happen, debates really over how to achieve women's suffrage, whether they should go state by state or for a federal amendment, whether men should be involved in the movement or whether it should just be women-led. And there were also racist debates, whether black women and women of color as a whole should be involved. All of these divides serve to slow down the movement. I'm skipping over quite a bit, but I'm trying to get us up to the 20th century. And the 20th century, as things are changing with the rise of new women, with more women working, this pushes women's suffrage forward a lot more. And this new generation, these new women, really come to the forefront. Women like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and they start fighting for the right to vote in different ways. They ultimately are going to form the National Women's Party, and you're having to read about the techniques and tactics of the NWP, but they believed in active action to push the issue of women's suffrage. No more writing letters and hosting teas and asking politely for it. No more fighting for it state to state. Although the state to state movement was working, it was working very slowly, and they wanted to push the movement faster and harder. So they started to do things that were considered very radical for the time. Some of their bigger techniques were the parade, the march on Washington, D.C., held the day after the the day before the presidential inauguration in 1913. I'm having you watch a clip of that from the film Iron-Jawed Angels. And then they also staged different protests. The most famous would be the Silent Sentinel protest, where women from the NWP stood silently, as the name suggests, outside of the White House from dawn till dusk, Monday through Saturday. They vowed that they would do this until women got the right to vote. They began this in January of 1917. They'll actually continue until June of 1919, when Congress finally passes the 19th Amendment. Things got a little bit iffy in there once the United States went to war, once the United States starts to participate in the Great War, or World War I as we now know it. Then these women started to look like they were being overly critical of the United States. They were viewed as traitors by many people. They started to critique the president, who argued that we are fighting this war for democracy, to spread people's wishes throughout the world, that we shouldn't have people who didn't have a voice in their governments. And women said, hey, how about us here in the United States? Over half the population here doesn't have the right to vote. They would use the president, this is Woodrow Wilson, they would use the president's words against him in their Silent Sentinel protests. They started to get arrested in June of 1917, and their idea was, keep arresting us. The more you arrest, the more women we'll send out the next day to protest. And they started to fill up the courts and the jails. They were actually sent to a workhouse in Virginia. Alice Paul ultimately will get arrested. And if you've seen the film Iron-Jawed Angels, it details the treatment in that workhouse or that jail and how she stages a hunger protest while in jail. The hunger protest was actually over the conditions of the jail, which were very bad as well. That starts to change the tide in the United States. This actually garnered more sympathy for them as word got out about how poorly these women suffragists were being treated. Now, some suffragists had argued that women should have the right to vote because they were seen as a more pure or more gentle sex. And the idea was we can clean up politics, we can clean up the government, we can clean up society. If their major role is to be mothers or wives or in charge of the private sphere, they said we need the right to vote so that we can create good homes and safe families and good communities for our future voters. Alice Paul and others in the NWP said, we're not even going to go down that gendered argument. Women should have the right to vote because they are citizens of the United States. The president ultimately agreed after a lot of public pressure. He pressured Congress in turn to pass the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women's right to vote. Congress does so in June of 1919, goes out to the states because enough states have to ratify it. It takes another year, and we don't see the actual ratification happening until mid-August of 1920. August 19th, the final state that was needed numerically for it, Tennessee, voted off on it. Secretary of State held it for another week until August 26th before he signed off on it. But we celebrate August 26th now as National Women's Equality Day. That's the kind of down and dirty on women's suffrage. It's a wonderful movement. If you're at all more interested in it, I'm sure I could provide more information on it. Again, I enjoy the topic a great deal if you didn't know, and I think that's it. Have a good week.